There are places on this planet that do not appear the way the maps suggest. Places where the silence is not peaceful but watchful, where the mountains do not simply stand, they loom, where the ice does not simply exist, it remembers. Alaska is one of those places, the largest and least understood state in the United States. A landmass so vast that if you placed it over the lower 48 states, it would stretch from coast to coast and still have land left over. But size alone does not explain what Alaska truly is. To understand it, you need to go deeper. You need to go into the stories that do not make it into the textbooks, the ones passed down in whispers by the Athabascan peoples who have lived there for thousands of years, the ones scrawled in the journals of explorers who came back, changed, or did not come back at all. Today, we go to Alaska. Not the Alaska of cruise ships and gold rush museums, the other one. Let us begin with something that most people do not even register when they look at a map. Alaska is not simply big. It is incomprehensibly big in a way the human brain genuinely struggles to process. The state covers over 663,000 square miles. That means it is more than twice the size of Texas. It has more coastline than all of the other American states combined, roughly 33,904 miles of it. If you were to walk that coastline at a steady pace, stopping only to sleep, it would take you years. Years of nothing but the wind off the Bering Sea and the sound of waves breaking against rock that has not been touched by human hands in decades. There are entire mountain ranges in Alaska that have no official names, valleys that no living person has ever entered, river systems that have never been fully mapped. When cartographers tried to complete the full survey of Alaska in the 20th century, they had to admit that certain regions simply resisted documentation. The terrain changed too fast. The ice shifted. The ground itself seemed unwilling to be known. And speaking of ice, what is happening beneath it is one of the most extraordinary geological realities on the planet. Alaska sits at the convergence of the Pacific and North American tectonic plates, which makes it one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. Of the 10 largest earthquakes ever recorded in American history, 7 happened in Alaska. The 1964 Good Friday earthquake that struck near Prince William Sound was so powerful a magnitude of 9.2 that it remains the second largest earthquake ever recorded anywhere on the planet. The ground in Anchorage dropped by as much as 8 feet in certain areas. Landslides buried entire neighborhoods. The tsunami it generated traveled all the way to California, Oregon, and Hawaii, killing people thousands of miles from the source. But here is what the official reports do not fully capture. Witnesses describe the earth not shaking, but breathing. Long, slow undulations, like the back of something enormous turning over in its sleep beneath the ground. Some survivors said they saw the ground ripple, like the surface of a lake, and then it stopped. And the silence that followed, according to every account, was unlike any silence they had ever experienced before or since. But the geology of Alaska is not only violent, it is also impossibly strange in ways that go beyond earthquakes. There's a place in Alaska called the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, located near Katmai National Park. In 1912, the Erupted volcano erupted in what scientists now consider the largest volcanic eruption of the entire 20th century. It released so much ash and gas that the resulting cloud darkened skies as far away as Vancouver, Canada, and affected global temperatures for an entire year. The valley floor was buried under hundreds of feet of volcanic material. When explorers from the National Geographic Society finally reached the area 4 years later, in 1916, what they found defied description. The entire valley floor was venting steam and gas from thousands of cracks in the earth, like a landscape that was still trying to exhale. The explorer Robert Griggs, who led the expedition, wrote in his notes that he felt certain, standing in that valley, that he had found the entrance to something that human language was not equipped to describe. The venting has slowed significantly over the past century, but the valley still breathes faintly, constantly. Now we go somewhere darker. Long before European explorers arrived in Alaska, the indigenous peoples of the region had developed rich and sophisticated oral traditions about the land they inhabited. Among the Yupik people of Western Alaska, there exists a class of stories that are not told during the summer months. These stories are reserved specifically for the long dark of winter, and they concern things that are said to exist in the territory between the known and the unknown. One recurring figure across multiple indigenous traditions is known by different names in different communities, but the description is strikingly consistent. A creature that moves at the edge of vision, tall, much taller than any man, with proportions that are almost human but not quite right. The neck too long, the arms reaching below where arms should reach. The footprints, when found, sinking deeper into the snow than any animal of equivalent size should sink, as if whatever made them was denser than it appeared. The Athabascan people called it by a name that translates roughly as the one that does not want to be seen. They did not consider it a monster. They considered it old, older than the mountains, something that was here before any of them arrived and would be here long after. In 1921, a fur trapper named Bud Lanning filed a report with a trading post near the Kuskokwim River, describing a set of tracks he found running parallel to his own for nearly 6 miles through fresh snow. He described them as human-like, but wider. He said he heard no sound from whatever made them. He never saw the source. He never trapped in that region again. You would think that a place as remote and unvisited as much of Alaska is would have few documented mysteries. But the opposite is true, because the few people who do venture deep into Alaska's interior tend to come back with accounts that resist easy explanation. Take the case of the disappearances along the Bermuda-like triangle that Alaskans know simply as the Alaska Triangle. This is a roughly defined area covering a vast swath of the state between Barrow in the north, Juneau in the southeast, and Anchorage in the south. Since records began being kept, more people per capita have gone missing in this region than in almost any other comparably sized area in the United States. In 1972, a small plane carrying House Majority Leader Hale Boggs and 3 others disappeared somewhere in this region. No wreckage was ever found despite one of the largest search operations in Alaskan history. Military aircraft have vanished. Hikers have walked into the wilderness and simply ceased to exist as far as any search party could determine. The official explanations, weather, terrain, disorientation, are reasonable. But they do not account for the consistency, and they do not account for the fact that several of these disappearances occurred in conditions that should not have led to fatal accidents. Local pilots have their own theory, passed down informally, that there are places in the interior of Alaska where the instruments simply stop working, not malfunction. Stop. And then work again 10 minutes later when you have moved past a certain invisible boundary. Nobody has ever published a paper on this phenomenon, but almost every experienced Alaskan pilot knows what you are talking about when you bring it up. Let us move from the sky to the sea. The waters that surround Alaska are some of the most productive and also some of the most dangerous on the planet. The Bering Sea alone produces more seafood than any other body of water in the United States. Roughly half of all the seafood consumed in America comes from Alaskan waters. But that same sea is also one of the deadliest bodies of water in the world for fishermen. The combination of extreme weather, unpredictable ice, and waves that can reach 60 feet in storm conditions makes it a place where the margin for error is essentially zero. But beyond the statistics, the Bering Sea has a quality that longtime fishermen describe in a particular way. They say the sea has a personality, that it is not indifferent to you the way most open ocean feels indifferent. They say it watches. The old Yupik name for the Bering Sea refers to it as something closer to a living entity than a body of water. And there are accounts, multiple, from separate sources, going back centuries, of things seen in those waters that do not correspond to any known species. Not sea monsters in the dramatic sense, but shapes. Large, slow shapes at depth, visible only in calm conditions and certain light angles, moving in ways that do not match whales, not sharks, not anything cataloged. A marine biologist who spent 3 field seasons on Alaskan fishing vessels once said, off the record, that the deep water of the Bering Sea is so understudied that any estimate of what lives there beyond 1,000 feet is essentially a guess. Alaska has some of the most extreme weather on Earth, and the sun itself does not behave the way it does anywhere else in the United States. Above the Arctic Circle, which cuts through Alaska's northern region, the sun does not set for weeks during summer. This is the midnight sun, and it is documented, it is scientific, it is real, but what is less discussed is what it does to the human mind. There is a condition known as Arctic mania, or midnight sun syndrome, that is not classified as a formal disorder in most psychiatric literature, but is recognized informally by Alaskan health workers. People who are new to the Arctic experience sleep disruption, elevated mood, impulsive decision-making, and in some documented cases, a sense of expanded perception, a feeling that the mind is opening in ways it cannot normally access. The Inupiat people of northern Alaska do not pathologize this experience. For them, the long day is a sacred time, a window when the boundary between the physical and the spiritual world is thinner than usual. They have ceremonies specific to this period. They have protocols for what you do and do not do when the sun refuses to set. The idea that light itself could alter not just sleep but consciousness is not superstition. Chronobiology, the science of how light affects biological systems, confirms that uninterrupted light exposure fundamentally alters brain chemistry. What it cannot fully explain is why some people, during their first Arctic summer, report dreaming while awake. In the winter, the opposite occurs. The polar night descends on northern Alaska, and for weeks the sun does not rise at all. The darkness is total, and it is heavy in a way that those who have experienced it consistently describe as physical, like a pressure. In this darkness, the aurora borealis, the northern lights, becomes the dominant presence in the sky. And while the scientific explanation for the aurora is well established, it is caused by charged particles from the sun interacting with the Earth's magnetic field. The experience of watching it from the Alaskan interior is something that no description fully prepares you for. The lights move. They shift and pulse and fold. They make shapes that the mind tries to interpret as intentional. The Athabascan and Inupiat peoples have their own explanations for what the aurora is. Some traditions hold that the lights are the spirits of animals, of caribou, of whales, of wolves, moving through the sky. Others say the lights are the souls of people who died in a particular way, and that if you whistle at them, they will descend. Scientists confirm that on rare occasions, during extreme geomagnetic events, the aurora does in fact produce sound, a faint crackling or swishing heard at ground level. For years, this was dismissed as impossible. In 2016, researchers in Finland confirmed it with recordings. The sounds exist. The lights make noise. What the Athabascan elders called spirit sound, physics is only now catching up to. Let us talk about the animals. Alaska is home to wildlife that exists at a scale seen nowhere else in the United States. There are more grizzly bears in Alaska than in all other American states combined. The Kodiak bear, native to the Kodiak archipelago off southern Alaska, is the largest land carnivore on Earth by average weight, capable of reaching over 1,500 pounds. But the animal that most defines Alaska in the imagination, the wolf, is perhaps the least fully understood. The wolves of Alaska's interior are not the depleted, cautious animals of the lower 48. They are larger, bolder, and have developed behavioral patterns that researchers describe as unusually sophisticated. Wolf packs in the Alaskan interior have been observed conducting what can only be described as coordinated reconnaissance, sending individual members ahead of a hunt to assess terrain and then returning to the pack, a behavior that suggests a level of strategic planning that most behavioral models for wolves do not account for. One researcher who spent 8 winters tracking a single pack near the Alaska range described an occasion in which a pack of 12 wolves followed her research team's snowmobile route for 3 consecutive days, staying precisely out of visual range but leaving prints that suggested they were tracking the trackers. She published her findings in a narrow academic journal, and the paper received almost no attention. She considered it the most significant thing she had ever observed. Now, we need to talk about something that very few people outside of Alaska know about, something that sits at the intersection of geology, history, and an almost incomprehensible scale of natural change: the land bridge. Between approximately 30,000 and 11,000 years ago, the Bering Land Bridge, a vast stretch of land connecting what is now Alaska to what is now Siberia, was exposed above sea level. This was not a narrow strip. At its maximum extent, it was over 1,000 miles wide, a massive grassland ecosystem called Beringia, home to woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, giant ground sloths, and dozens of other megafauna now extinct. It was across this land that the first humans arrived in the Americas, following the animals they hunted. The descendants of those first travelers would eventually spread across 2 continents and become every indigenous people of North and South America. All of them traceable back to this single corridor of Alaskan land that no longer exists, swallowed by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. What is stranger still is that the permafrost of Alaska, the permanently frozen ground that underlies most of the state, still contains the preserved remains of those animals. Intact woolly mammoths have been found in Alaskan permafrost, their flesh still present after 40,000 years. In several cases, the stomach contents were preserved. Researchers have found undigested flowers and grasses inside the stomachs of mammoths, still bearing their original colors, the last thing a woolly mammoth ate, preserved for 40 millennia in Alaskan ice. There's a town in Alaska called Barrow, now officially renamed Utqiagvik, that is the northernmost city in the United States. Located at 71 degrees north latitude, it is a place where winter temperatures can drop to minus 56 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill, where the Arctic Ocean freezes within sight of the shore, and where the culture has preserved traditions that are thousands of years old. But Utqiagvik is also a place where something unprecedented is being observed in real time. The permafrost beneath the town and the surrounding tundra is thawing. Not slowly in geological terms, in human terms. Roads are buckling. Buildings are tilting. The coastline is eroding at a rate of several feet per year in some locations, because the sea ice that used to protect the coast in winter is forming later and melting earlier than at any point in recorded history. What is being released from the thawing permafrost is not only infrastructure problems. The permafrost of Alaska contains an estimated 1,500 billion tons of organic carbon, more carbon than is currently present in the Earth's entire atmosphere. As it thaws, that carbon is being released as methane and carbon dioxide. Scientists studying this process say that the feedback loop it creates, released carbon warms the atmosphere, warmer atmosphere thaws more permafrost. More permafrost releases more carbon is one of the most consequential and least understood processes currently underway on the planet. In certain areas of Alaska, so much methane is being released from thawing lake beds that you can ignite the surface of the water with a match. Let us go back to something older. Among the most sacred and least visited places in Alaska is the Brooks Range, a mountain chain that runs east to west across the northern part of the state, essentially cutting off the Arctic slope from the rest of Alaska. The Brooks Range contains some of the most remote and unaltered wilderness left on Earth. There are no roads through most of it. There are entire sections that have received fewer than 10 human visitors in recorded history. The Nunamiut people, an Inupiat group who live in the interior of the Brooks Range, have maintained an unbroken relationship with this landscape for over 1,000 years, and their oral traditions about it contain accounts of things in the mountains that do not correspond to any known geology. Among these is a recurring description of a valley, accessible only through a specific pass that is visible only in certain light conditions, where the animals do not flee from humans, where the caribou allow themselves to be approached and the wolves sleep in the open. The Nunamiut call this place by a name that translates roughly as the place where the old agreement still holds. They say it is a place where the original relationship between humans and animals before the world changed is still intact. No Western expedition has ever documented this valley. Several have looked for it. There is an account from a bush pilot in 1953 who claimed to have seen from the air a valley matching the description, a place impossibly green in a landscape of rock and permafrost, with animals visible from altitude behaving in ways that made no sense. He circled twice. He could not find it again on any subsequent flight, and he flew those mountains for another 20 years. There is one more thing you need to know about Alaska, and it concerns the sky. Not the aurora, not the midnight sun, something else. There are a documented category of atmospheric phenomena in Alaska that occur almost nowhere else on Earth with such frequency and intensity. One of them is called the Novaya Zemlya effect, an extreme form of superior mirage, named after an incident in the Arctic in 1597, in which the sun appeared above the horizon 17 days earlier than it should have, due to unusual atmospheric refraction. In Alaska, this phenomenon causes entire mountain ranges to appear suspended above the horizon, inverted and floating. Islands that are below the visible horizon appear in the sky. Ships that are 20 miles away appear to be sailing through the air. First-time witnesses describe it as profoundly disorienting, and not only visually. The silence of the Alaskan interior already removes most of the sensory anchors that the human nervous system relies on. When the landscape itself then begins to behave like a hallucination, something deeper shifts. There are accounts, many of them, from explorers and aviators and indigenous hunters, of people experiencing a sense of radical displacement in time during extended exposure to the Alaskan interior. Not confusion, something more specific. The sense that the boundary between past and present had become permeable, that they could perceive the landscape as it was, but also as it had been in a way they could not explain and did not want to explain to anyone who had not experienced it. The Athabascan elders say this is normal. They say the land is not static. They say Alaska does not only exist in the present, that it holds all of its moments simultaneously, and that sometimes, when a person is quiet enough and open enough, they begin to perceive that. Alaska, then, is not simply a place. It is a condition. It is what happens when land exists at a scale that refuses to be domesticated. When history is written not in books, but in ice and permafrost, and the long memory of people who have never needed to write anything down. The volcanoes are still active. The permafrost is still thawing. The wolves are still watching. And somewhere in the Brooks Range, there is a valley that appears only in certain light, where the old agreement still holds, and where the animals are not afraid. You can look for it, many people have, but Alaska will show you what it wants to show you when it is ready, and not a moment before